Hey guys, tonight we slip beneath the rough wool blankets of a dimly lit medieval cottage. You're lying on a creaky straw mattress, pressed between the low timber walls and the smoky hearth, the air thick with the scent of sweat, firewood, and yesterday's onions. Outside, it's cold, bitter wind howling through the thatched roof. Inside, it's warmer, but not because of a fireplace. It's because 5, maybe 6, people are crammed into this single-room home. And 2 of them are doing something you weren't expecting to witness this close up. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not sleeping alone. That's your first medieval reality check. Privacy, as you know it, just doesn't exist here. In fact, the very idea of having your own room, let alone a door you could lock, is laughable unless you're nobility. Most people are living peasant lives, and peasant homes are compact, busy, and brutally efficient. In some, livestock might even sleep indoors with you, tucked in against the cold. Sex therefore happens where it happens. You might try to wait until the kids are asleep, or until the neighbor's whispers dull, or until your mother-in-law, who also lives with you, turns to face the wall, but waiting doesn't always work. So sometimes sex happens quietly, sometimes not, and sometimes it doesn't happen at all because medieval life is exhausting. You've worked from dawn to dusk in fields, hauling carts, tending animals. The ache in your body might be louder than your desire. Still, intimacy isn't dead. In fact, in its own way, it's deeply woven into medieval survival. Sharing a bed was a necessity, both for warmth and companionship. Sometimes unmarried people even shared beds, not always sexually. Bed sharing was just normal. So normal, in fact, that young apprentices would often sleep beside their masters. Travelers bunked up with strangers. It wasn't inherently sexual, but it could become that. And that's where things get complicated. Now let's talk about what you're wearing in this dream. Or rather, what you're not. Most medieval folks didn't sleep in pajamas. You're likely down to a shift, or entirely nude, especially if you're married. Naked sleeping wasn't scandalous. It was practical. Fewer layers meant fewer fleas, fewer lice. And in a time where weekly baths were ambitious, that counted. Here's the thing, sex wasn't just a pastime, it was a duty. Marriage wasn't about romance. It was about alliances, property, and producing children. And sex was how you did that. The church, ever watchful, called it the marital debt. Spouses owed each other sex. Denying it without a very good reason, like illness or religious fasting, was grounds for annulment. That's right, if you said "not tonight" too many times, you could be taken to court. Literal court. Still, people didn't always rush to the sheets. Many married young, yes, but often didn't live together right away. Economic pressure meant delayed cohabitation, even if the vows had already been exchanged. And medieval weddings weren't the giant celebrations we imagine. Some were quiet affairs done at a church door, with little more than a handshake and a muttered agreement. Let's shift perspective. You're now curled up beside a fire, listening to an old woman tell a story, one filled with caution and curiosity. She's sharing a tale about sex, but it's coded. Medieval folk often used metaphors and folklore to discuss intimacy, plowing the field, shooting arrows, even bread-baking analogies. Why? Because open talk of sex could be dangerous. Gossip could destroy reputations. And in villages where everyone knew everyone, privacy was power. And yet, despite the silence, people got creative. Lovers passed secret notes, arranged late-night rendezvous in barns, or used local festivals as opportunities to sneak away. Ever heard of church ales? These were fundraising drinking parties hosted by parishes, but historians still argue whether they were just about beer or a socially acceptable excuse to mingle freely and, well, find someone to share that narrow straw mattress with. Not everyone had equal freedom, though. Women were often expected to remain virgins until marriage, men less so. Double standards thrived. A woman caught pregnant before marriage could be publicly shamed, fined, or worse. And yet, records show that premarital sex was shockingly common. So common, in fact, that in some English parishes up to 30% of brides were already pregnant at the altar. This practice, called womb checking, wasn't just accepted in some regions, it was encouraged. A working womb was proof of fertility, and for families desperate for heirs, it mattered more than virtue. And then there's bedding ceremonies. Imagine being newly married and the whole village shows up to escort you to your bed. Yes, that bed. They might sing, throw nuts symbolizing fertility, or sit outside the room until they hear signs that the marriage is official. And yes, sometimes they waited for sounds, sometimes for a sheet, sometimes they barged in. Depends on the region and the appetite for drama. Let's pause for a curious detail. In colder areas, some people had bed staves, literal sticks used to keep blankets in place, or sometimes to gently poke the snoring spouse on the other side. Romantic, right? And speaking of snoring, you're not exactly getting a quiet night. Between livestock, creaky beds, and coughing children, medieval intimacy came with background noise. No candles glowing beside the bed either, those were expensive. Most sex happened in darkness, in silence, and with the barest physical comfort. The idea of a romantic night wasn't even in the vocabulary. It was about duty, warmth, and sometimes something a little more tender, something that slipped through the cracks in this hard world. So beneath the furs and firelight, sex wasn't glamorous, but it was present. Daily life may have been brutal, but the need for closeness, for human connection, it endured. And even without privacy or passion or perfume, people still found ways to reach for each other in the dark. You wake up itchy, not metaphorically. Your linen shift is clinging to your back with a thin sheen of sweat and something's crawling on your leg, probably fleas again. No surprise, really, mattresses are rarely cleaned and the straw inside is older than your youngest child. You swat half-heartedly, roll over, and bump into your partner. Not your spouse, mind you. This might be your master's son, your foster sibling, or a stranger you just met at the alehouse. It's complicated. But let's get to the metal elephant in the room. Chastity belts. You've seen them in museums. You've seen them in memes. Spiked metal contraptions, padlocked over a woman's body, designed to keep her pure until her husband came home from the Crusades. A nightmare of iron and keyholes. A tale so widely believed, it feels like truth. Except it almost certainly is. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were real medieval tools or elaborate Renaissance jokes, or later Victorian kink artifacts misattributed to earlier centuries. While a few belts survive in museums, many are now considered hoaxes, or ceremonial items never meant to be worn. Think warning signs more than actual appliances. Because, let's be honest, locking someone into a metal undergarment without causing severe infection isn't exactly medically sound, especially in a world without antibiotics or breathable fabrics. But the myth endures. Why? Because it plays into a powerful idea that medieval sexuality, especially female sexuality, was something to be controlled, watched, guarded, feared. So if not metal belts, what did control it? Let's rewind a bit. You're now a young woman in a village where everything you do, everything is seen. You walk to the well, 3 gossips clock the sway of your hips. You linger at the market stall, someone wonders if you're up to something. Your virginity isn't just yours, it's a community asset. If it's lost, your family's honor is dented. Your marriage prospects crumble. You might be called a wanton, a whore, a devil's vessel. Yes, that was a real phrase. But don't think men had it easy either. Sure, the rules were looser, but not invisible. A young man could be whipped, fined, or even imprisoned for sleeping with someone else's fiancée. Repeat offenders got labeled fornicators in public church lists, shamed alongside their partners. And if you happened to seduce a noblewoman, you'd better pray you could run faster than her father's men. Still, rules or no rules, people had sex, lots of it, and sometimes they planned to. That's where courtship rituals come in. Enter bundling. It sounds cozy, right? 2 unmarried people, wrapped in blankets, lying beside each other, fully clothed, ideally with a bundling board between them, meant to allow intimate conversation while keeping things PG. The problem? Hormones and proximity aren't famous for following rules. Historians still debate how often bundling turned sexual, but let's just say a lot of 14th century bobbies had 9-month timelines that made village priests raise an eyebrow. Of course, this doesn't mean people were wild libertines. On the contrary, guilt and shame were constant bedfellows. The church taught that sex outside marriage was a sin, and that even within marriage it was only acceptable if the goal was reproduction. Enjoying it too much, sin. Doing it on a Sunday, sin. Trying anything remotely adventurous, double sin. You're starting to notice a pattern here. Still, some tried to navigate this landscape. Manuals like the Book of the Knight of the Tower advised noblewomen to avoid laughing too much because it made them look sexually loose, and warned young girls not to walk alone in gardens. Gardens, it turns out, were suspicious places. Too many metaphors. But while the church obsessed over purity, not everyone played by those rules. In some parts of Europe, festivals like Carnival turned the whole world upside down. Peasants dressed like lords, fools wore crowns, and sexual taboos were gleefully mocked. Men cross-dressed, lovers danced under moonlight, and for a few nights the world forgot to be so serious. And when the party was over, the priest stepped in. Confession booths became medieval therapy sessions where sinners poured out their desires, their fears, and their failures. A priest might ask exactly what you did, with whom, and in what position, not out of perversion, supposedly, but to assign the proper penance. 5 Hail Marys for kissing, 10 for fondling, 30 if you forgot it was Lent. Imagine sitting across from a man who smells like incense and damp stone, trying to explain why you couldn't keep your hands off your neighbor's son. Awkward doesn't even cover it. And yet forgiveness was possible. That's the twisted brilliance of the system. Sin was inevitable but redeemable. You could slip, fall, roll around a bit, get up, and be welcomed back into the fold, as long as you were sorry. That said, remorse didn't fix everything. Women who got pregnant out of wedlock often faced harsh realities. They might be forced to name the father in court, produce witnesses, or surrender their child to a monastery. Some records even show medieval paternity tests involving herbs, hair clippings, and, weirdly, cheese, none of which worked. But here's a gentler truth. Not all medieval people lived in fear. Some couples, even arranged ones, grew to love each other. Some whispered jokes in bed. Some held hands on frostbitten mornings. Some found tiny, stolen moments of joy. Because even in a world full of rules and reputations, the desire to connect, to be known, to be touched, it never goes away. So no, chastity belts probably weren't real, but the urge to protect, control, or punish sexuality, that was very real, and it shaped medieval life more than any iron padlock ever could. You kneel beside a flickering candle in a stone chapel. The air is cold and heavy with incense. Your breath fogs faintly in front of you. Your knees ache against the flagstones, and the priest's voice drones from the confessional booth. You've been waiting your turn to confess something private. Something, not quite sinful maybe, but definitely not saintly. You're about to whisper a story that's more bedroom than Bible. Welcome to the church's grip on medieval sex life. The church didn't just dabble in the bedroom, it tried to rent space there. From the highest cathedral to the humblest village altar, priests issued rules about when, where, how, and why you could have sex. And they were very clear about one thing: sex was for procreation only, not pleasure, not bonding, not just because the goats are asleep and it's Tuesday. And while that seems strict today, for medieval Christians it was law. Not just moral law, eternal soul at stake kind of law. You and your spouse are required to fulfill your marital debt. Yes, that's the real phrase. It sounds like something from a bad medieval fantasy novel, but it was a real canon law principle. Spouses owed each other sex, regularly. Denying your partner for too long could actually be taken to church court. You could be labeled as neglectful, sinful, even grounds for annulment if the situation got dire enough. But here's the kicker. The church also limited when you were allowed to fulfill that debt. Ready for this? You couldn't have sex during Lent, or Advent, or on the eves of feast days, or on feast days, or Sundays, or Fridays, or Wednesdays depending on the region, or during a woman's period, or while pregnant, or while breastfeeding, or within 3 days of receiving communion. And of course, no sex during daylight hours. So if you're keeping track, that left, 3 nights a month maybe. Historians still argue whether people actually obeyed these rules. Some probably did. Fear of eternal damnation is persuasive. Others, not so much. Confessional records are filled with people who tried and failed to follow the endless list of restrictions. A typical confession might go something like, "We lay together the night before St. Agatha's feast, and also on the Tuesday following," and the priest would nod grimly and assign the appropriate prayers. Some priests even had little sin guides, manuals that listed different sexual acts, their level of sinfulness, and suggested penance. Think of it as a medieval menu of misbehavior: holding hands, mild; sex in unusual positions. Now we're talking days of fasting; oral sex, weeks; anal sex, a month of bread and water plus no speaking privileges during meals. Still, these guides also revealed how much priests were hearing these things. People didn't confess imaginary sins. They confessed what they were doing. And apparently, people were getting pretty inventive under the hayloft. One actual surviving manual by a 13th century confessor includes this gem. If the couple commits the act in a standing position, it is worse than if it is done lying down, for it shows greater lust. So yes, there was a church-approved position, lying down, face-to-face, and preferably while thinking about Jesus and taxes. Let's shift scenes. Imagine a medieval couple in a small village. They're married, devout, and honestly trying to stay on the straight and narrow. They even follow the conjugal calendar, which many households had guides that marked out which nights were clean and which were spiritually off-limits. Some of these calendars were hand-copied onto the back of prayer books, literal sex schedules next to psalms. But what if you weren't married? That's when the church really clamped down. Fornication, sex before or outside of marriage, was one of the most commonly confessed sins. And if it resulted in pregnancy, things got complicated fast. Unmarried mothers were often forced into public penance. That could mean wearing sackcloth to Mass, standing outside the church barefoot, or even being whipped in front of the congregation. Harsh, yes, but it was also designed to deter others, a walking warning label. Of course, not all enforcement was that dramatic. Some people got off with lighter penalties, small fines, temporary social shunning, a few days of silence during communal meals. The punishment often depended on your status. A noble's indiscretion might be quietly handled. A servant's misstep could become public theater. And the church didn't just govern action, it tried to govern thought. Lustful thoughts were sins too. Impure dreams were frowned upon. Masturbation, deeply condemned, sometimes believed to cause physical illness or demonic possession. There are records of monks flagellating themselves after experiencing nocturnal emissions, which, let's be honest, just sounds like a sleepover gone terribly wrong. Here's a fringe detail. One 14th century monk believed that sleeping on your back increased sinful dreams. He advised brothers to sleep curled up, facing the wall, hands folded, like a dead person. Cozy. But let's not forget, the church wasn't a monolith. Practices and punishments varied by region, by century, and even by individual priest. Some confessors were fire and brimstone types. Others offered gentle, almost therapeutic counsel. Some emphasized mercy. Others enjoyed the drama a little too much. And despite all these efforts, sex remained everywhere. Behind barn doors, in the corners of cloisters, at festivals and fairs, people were people. They longed, they loved, they messed up. In fact, one of the more tender church rules, rare but real, was that spouses had to seek each other's consent before sex. Not because of modern ideas about consent, but because marriage was a mutual contract. That concept, radical in its time, suggested that even within this strict framework, the idea of shared intimacy mattered. Of course, enforcement was another story. So here you are again, kneeling in that cold chapel. You've whispered your truth. Maybe you feel lighter, maybe not. Maybe you're planning to do it all again next week. But for now, the priest murmurs a prayer, assigns your penance, and sends you on your way. The church may have had rules, but life had its own rhythm, a rhythm that even 1,000 sermons couldn't fully silence. You're standing in the village square. It's market day and the place smells like fish, sweat, and stale beer. Chickens cluck underfoot, someone playing a bone flute off-key. It's all charmingly chaotic until the bailiff arrives. He's not here for vegetables, he's here for you. Or rather, for someone like you who made a perfectly normal human decision to sleep with someone unmarried. The problem, that's not just a personal matter in your world, it's a legal offense. Tonight, we delve into a side of medieval sexuality that rarely gets screen time. What happened when people got caught? Let's say you were a man caught fornicating with your neighbor's daughter. You might be fined, flogged, or, if you were a repeat offender, publicly shamed in front of the entire parish. In some towns, your name would be posted on church doors like a wanted poster. In a few places, you'd be made to walk through the streets with your britches inside out, because embarrassment, apparently, is the path to moral redemption. For women, the consequences were even heavier. If unmarried and pregnant, you faced what some called a virginity tax, a hefty fine paid to both the church and the local lord. Why both? Because you offended both God and the social order. And that social order cared a lot about knowing who fathered whose child, especially when inheritance and land were at stake. But here, where it gets even more twisted, in many towns, couples who had sex before marriage could retroactively make it okay, if they got married fast enough. Some courts would dismiss fornication charges if the couple married immediately and stayed married for a set period, often a year and a day. Love triumphs, more like paperwork does. Of course, some people tried to skip the fines by denying everything. That's where character witnesses came in. Neighbors might be asked whether they'd seen you sneaking around after dark, whether they'd heard certain noises, whether you looked too cheerful the morning after the last feast day. Yes, in the Middle Ages, your bedroom life was everyone's business. And then there's the bedding oath, a legal declaration made after marriage. Sometimes, in disputed unions, the couple would have to testify that they'd known each other carnally. And if someone challenged that oath, you could be summoned to court to describe the experience in mortifying detail. There are preserved records, actual court transcripts, where people describe wedding nights in language so awkward it would make modern juries squirm. But what if you didn't want to get married? What if it was a one-time thing? You could still be hauled before an ecclesiastical court. These weren't criminal courts. They didn't send people to dungeons, but they could order public penance, fines, or social exile. One 14th century record shows a couple forced to sit outside their parish church in the rain for 3 days, wearing signs that read, "We fornicated." And for noble families, the stakes were higher still. A daughter, fall from virtue, could mean ruined alliances, lost dowries, political disaster. Some noblewomen were shipped off to nunneries, not always voluntarily. Others were married off in haste, with bribes and hush money to smooth things over. You might be wondering, were these punishments common? Were people really policed this intensely? Historians still argue whether enforcement was strict or symbolic. Some believe local officials turned a blind eye unless pregnancy or scandal forced their hand. Others argue that the rise of written court records in the 13th and 14th centuries shows an increasingly obsessed society, one that tracked sexual behavior with bureaucratic zeal. Here's a strange twist. While fornication was punished, adultery was often treated more severely, especially for women. A married woman caught cheating could lose her dowry, her children, even her teeth. Yes, tooth removal was one recorded penalty in parts of France, because nothing says repent like chewing bread with a gap-toothed grin. Men, of course, got off lighter. A married man sleeping with a servant might face a small fine. A noble might face none at all, especially if his lover was of lower rank. Social hierarchy was a shield, unless you were sleeping upwards. Then it became a threat. Take this. In 1322, an English peasant woman named Alice was fined for enticing a monk into lewd company by offering him milk, bread, and long glances. The monk, he received a brief suspension. Alice, 2 weeks of fasting and public shame, because nothing says equal justice like blaming the dairy. Let's not forget about church wardens, local moral police who sometimes kept track of who was cohabiting without marriage, who was sleeping in whose cottage after curfew, who suddenly had a baby with no visible husband. In some towns, there were even lairwhite fines, a kind of tax on sexual misconduct, paid to the Lord. In a weird way, sin became a revenue stream. Still, human nature being what it is, people found ways around the rules. Fake marriages, secret oaths, promises made in dark corners that technically counted under canon law. In fact, many couples engaged in what historians call clandestine marriages, binding but unrecorded unions. 2 people simply said, "I take you as my spouse," in the presence of witnesses or even just God. No priest, no party, no paperwork, which sounds romantic until it blew up in court later. Quirky fact, one medieval bishop once ruled that even whispering, "I marry you" during intercourse, if you meant it, could count as a legal marriage. Now imagine that being brought up in a trial. "Your Honor, I swear," he said it just before climax, not your standard vows. By the late Middle Ages, authorities started cracking down harder on secret unions. Registries grew. Clerks tracked who was married, where, and to whom. Not out of romance, of course, but because marriage was tied to taxes, property, and political alliances. Keeping it neat was in everyone's financial interest. Yet even with all these restrictions, fines, oaths, and court appearances, people didn't stop reaching for each other. If anything, they got cleverer. Secret liaisons through shutters, midnight walks by the river, love tokens passed in bread loaves or sewn into sleeves. Medieval people weren't robots. They were tender, reckless, clever, and messy. Just like you. So the next time someone says the Middle Ages were all gloom, doom, and incense, tell them about the virginity taxes, the courtroom testimonies, and that one time someone tried to prove their marriage by reciting pillow talk to a priest. Because in a world where everything could cost you, people still risked it for a touch, a smile, a night, or a future. You're trudging along a dusty road. Your feet ache, your stomach's grumbling, and the sack slung over your shoulder contains everything you own: bread, a relic badge, and maybe a small token from someone you'd rather not talk about right now. You're not a criminal. You're not fleeing war. You're on pilgrimage, a holy journey to a sacred site, one that's supposed to cleanse your sins and soothe your soul. But let's be real. For many medieval pilgrims, not all sins were left behind. Some were collected along the way. Tonight, we're following the steamy, surprising trail of holy relics and horny pilgrims. You've probably heard of famous destinations like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Rome. These were holy hotspots, packed with the bones of saints, bits of the true cross, or in one case, Mary's belt. People came from across Europe to pray, to heal, to beg forgiveness. But they didn't travel alone. Pilgrimages were crowded. Imagine caravans of strangers walking together for weeks, sharing inns, beds, stories, and sometimes bodily warmth. Let's set the scene. You've been walking all day. You reach a town with one overcrowded inn and no private rooms. You're stuck in the common sleeping hall, lying shoulder to shoulder with peasants, merchants, widows, and priests. You're exhausted. Your boots are off. Someone next to you smells like cloves and wood smoke. One thing leads to another. Yes, sex on pilgrimage was common enough to be regulated. Some shrines posted moral codes. Others relied on traveling confessors to do damage control. But still, people slipped up. Some shrines even had attached brothels. You heard that right, religious tourism and sex work side by side. Because where crowds gather, so do opportunities. Pilgrimage offered something rare in medieval life: anonymity. Away from your village, you could reinvent yourself. A married woman might say she's a widow. A young man might pose as a humble friar, and somewhere along the road they meet. A few flirtatious glances at a holy spring, some wine at the inn, a whispered joke about St. Thomas's toe bone, and suddenly the journey becomes more personal. Historians still argue whether pilgrimage was spiritually sincere or a medieval excuse to party. Probably both. There were certainly pilgrims who walked barefoot for weeks, enduring hunger and blisters for their faith. But there were also those who used it as a way to escape home, explore new towns, or test boundaries. Take Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a 14th century text that presents pilgrims as a mixed bunch: bawdy millers, gossiping wives, flirtatious squires. These characters weren't fiction so much as a mirror. They reflected a truth many medievals recognized. Pilgrimage was where sinners and saints mingled, literally. There are even court records of pilgrim pregnancies, women returning home from holy journeys with miraculous conditions. Some claimed divine intervention. Others stayed very quiet. In one case, a woman named Agnes swore her pregnancy occurred near the shrine of St. Leonard after a vision. The local priest suspected the vision had a beard and a limp. But let's not just focus on mischief. Pilgrimage could also spark real, lasting connections. Shared hardship, shared stories, these created bonds. Some couples met on the road and married soon after. Some even delayed their religious devotions to travel together again the following season. And then there were the relics. Oh boy, relics weren't just spiritual magnets, they were also marketable objects of desire. You could buy tiny phials of saint's blood, usually colored oil, scraps of cloth from Christ's swaddling clothes, red, random rags, or even powdered bones labeled martyr dust. Many were fake. Some were shockingly real. A few had reputations. Pilgrims believed certain relics could boost fertility, cure impotence, or bless marriages. One shrine in Germany promised that drinking water touched to St. Foy's relic would ensure a strong, manly performance. Another, in Italy, kept a relic of St. Valentine's skull, allegedly helpful for marital passion, probably not what the saint had in mind. And guess what? Some of these shrines kept records of answered prayers, women who conceived after visiting, men who found wives. One even included a thank you note written in poetry, praising a saint for rekindling a flickering marital fire. It rhymed, poorly. There's even evidence of people using pilgrimage as punishment. A woman caught in adultery might be sentenced to walk to a distant shrine barefoot, confessing her sin at every stop. Some took this seriously. Others turned the punishment into a personal escape, meeting people, seeing new towns, even starting new relationships under the guise of penance. One curious fringe detail: in some regions, travelers carried special pilgrim badges, little metal tokens showing which shrine they'd visited. These were often worn proudly on hats or cloaks, but some people wore fake badges, claiming they'd gone farther, seen more, done more. Like a medieval version of padding your Instagram with vacation photos you didn't actually take. And just like now, the road was full of stories, some true, some exaggerated, some whispered in the dark and never repeated. So yes, medieval pilgrims sought God, but they also found other things: laughter, adventure, temptation, affection, even love. Picture yourself now sitting by a campfire beside the road. The stars are bright. Someone strums a lute. You're sore, dirty, and halfway to the next shrine. But tonight, for just a little while, you forget about sins and saints. You're just human, warmed by firelight, company, and maybe someone's hand gently brushing yours beneath a shared blanket. And tomorrow, you'll walk on, lighter, not necessarily holier, but somehow more complete. You're hovering in the back room of a small, smoky apothecary. Bundles of dried herbs hang from the rafters. Little clay pots are lined up in rows, and the old woman who runs the place is muttering something under her breath as she crushes a grayish root with a mortar and pestle. The smell is sharp, bitter, earthy, vaguely alarming. You're not here for a headache remedy or a wart salve. You've come for something, a little more personal. Tonight, we open the crumbling pages of medieval love potions, witchcraft, and aphrodisiacs. Let's be clear, medieval medicine didn't have a great track record. Bleeding, purging, and drinking wine mixed with powdered coral were all standard treatments. But when it came to matters of lust, love, and libido, the lines between science, superstition, and sorcery blurred completely. Because if you were unlucky in love or lacking in performance, there were solutions. They were just a bit unconventional. Like ground-up wolf penis. Yes, really. According to several medieval herbals, drying and grinding a wolf's genitals into powder and mixing it with red wine was said to restore the courage of a man whose desire falters. Courage is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. But that's just the beginning. There were dozens of alleged aphrodisiacs, some plant-based, some animal-based, and some downright demonic. Think wild lettuce, onions roasted in honey, pigeon droppings, or a paste made from antlers and mustard seed. If it grew, bled, or stank, someone probably believed it could help you perform better under the furs. Historians still debate whether these potions worked, or whether they simply gave people confidence. Because if you believe powdered beaver testicle boosts virility, you're already halfway to a good night. And the potions weren't just for men. Women, too, had access to remedies, though the goals were a little different. Female-focused recipes often promised to loosen the womb or increase the heat of the lower belly. Subtle. Some involved basil soaked in vinegar. Others included pigeon hearts or rose oil warmed gently over coals and applied, let's say, strategically. But here's the part that gets tricky. Or does medicine end and magic begin? That's the question that haunted medieval Europe. Because while physicians and healers dispensed aphrodisiacs and fertility tonics, cunning women, local wise women, midwives, and herbalists often provided similar remedies. And sometimes people couldn't tell the difference, or didn't care, until someone accused them of witchcraft. You see, the church was deeply suspicious of anything that suggested manipulation of nature, especially when it involved sex. Love potions. Those were risky business. Theologians argued over whether they interfered with free will, which, in Christian thought, was sacred. Making someone fall in love through herbs was dangerously close to demonic coercion. And if you were a woman dispensing such charms, you might be called a sorceress, especially if your remedies worked a little too well. There are documented cases where women were dragged before local courts and accused of causing love affairs, infertility, or unnatural desire through herbs, oils, or enchanted objects. Some were convicted, some weren't. But the fear was real, because while most of these women were just skilled in folk medicine, a little success or a little jealousy could turn a healer into a witch in the public eye. And then there were the amulets. Oh yes, medieval people loved a good charm. Want your husband to be more affectionate? Wear a dried frog in a pouch around your waist. Want your lover to remain faithful? Stitch their hair into a little cloth doll and sleep with it under your pillow. Some charms were even meant to be swallowed. One 13th century remedy involved writing a Latin love prayer on a piece of parchment, soaking it in holy water, and drinking the mixture. Nothing says romance like parchment soup. These weren't jokes. People took them seriously, especially when they were desperate. Here's a quirky fringe fact. Some medieval midwives were also experts in love magic. They might perform whispered rituals during births, anoint newborns with oils meant to inspire future charm, or secretly pass on aphrodisiac recipes to new brides. They straddled the line between medicine, magic, and womanly wisdom, respected by many, feared by a few. And while the church officially condemned love magic, it also borrowed from it. Take St. Valentine's relics. Yes, that Valentine. His bones were displayed in churches across Europe and often visited by those seeking help with romance. Some pilgrims left offerings, others left requests, written prayers asking for a specific person's affection. If that's not magical thinking, what is? Of course, not all magic was subtle. In some regions, jilted lovers would bury tokens under thresholds, scatter herbs at doorways, or even hire professional spellcasters. A court record from 1378 tells of a man who accused his neighbor of causing burning lust in his wife by planting rosemary beneath her window. The accused claimed he was simply helping her garden. The judge was not convinced. Let's talk desire for a second. In medieval medicine, everything boiled down to the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Desire, that was hot and moist, literally, which meant that lusty people were considered too full of blood, especially young women in springtime. The prescribed treatment: bleeding, cold foods, and staying indoors, because nothing ruins romance like leeches and barley soup. Yet despite the fear and the fuss, desire remained impossible to fully suppress. Whether through clove-studded honey, whispered charms, or back-alley herbs, people pursued passion with both hope and ingenuity. You find yourself now in the flickering shadows of that apothecary again. The old woman hands you a tiny bottle. She doesn't smile. She doesn't explain, but you know what it's for. And as you tuck it into your cloak, you realize something quietly profound. For all the rules, restrictions, and risks, the human desire to connect, to feel, to touch, to be wanted, will always find its way through the cracks. Even if it smells a little like boiled antlers and bad decisions. You're in a monastery now, but not in the chapel. Instead, you're behind the heavy wooden doors of the scriptorium, the place where monks spend their days hunched over parchment, copying sacred texts by candlelight. Except the manuscript on the table in front of you tonight isn't a Bible. Not even close. It's something far more risque, and its pages are alive with inked lovers, suggestive symbols, and eyebrow-raising allegory. Welcome to the peculiar world of monastic writings and erotic symbolism. Yes, really. Despite vows of celibacy and lifelong chastity, medieval monks and nuns didn't always write like angels. In fact, some of the most surprisingly sensual and symbolically loaded writings of the Middle Ages came from within monastery walls. Let's set the stage. You've probably heard that monks spent much of their time copying religious texts and illuminating manuscripts. That's true, but they also wrote original works, letters, theological treatises, mystical visions, and yes, poetry. And while much of it was deeply spiritual, there's a curious overlap between the divine and the desirous. Take Hildegard of Bingen, the famous 12th century abbess, mystic, and composer. Her visions were wild, flaming wheels, cosmic wombs, rivers of fire, and they weren't shy about sensual metaphor. In one vision, she describes the soul as entering God, like the heat of the sun penetrates everything. Subtle, not really. Even church-approved mysticism sometimes borrowed the language of physical union to describe spiritual ecstasy. And then there's Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote impassioned commentaries on the Song of Songs, the famously steamy Old Testament text that reads more like a love poem than a sermon. For Bernard, this wasn't a problem. He interpreted the text allegorically. The lover and beloved weren't human, they were the soul in Christ. But the language, still dripping with longing and metaphor. The kisses, the fragrances, the aching desire, they're all there. Historians still debate whether this religious eroticism was just spiritual metaphor or something more psychologically complex. Some argue it provided a safe channel for monks and nuns to process human desire. Others suggest it wasn't always as sublimated as it was supposed to be. And then we have the margins. Oh yes, those famous marginalia, tiny illustrations that monks added around the edges of manuscripts. Some were holy, angels, vines, and saints, but others, not so much. Rabbits jousting on snails, naked men doing handstands, monks mooning each other, and in some cases, outright lewdness, anthropomorphic genitals, nuns harvesting phallic fruit, and animals in compromising positions. Why? Well, that's one of those open scholarly debates. Some believe these were inside jokes among bored scribes. Others argue they were visual metaphors, satirical, moralizing, or just plain mischievous. Either way, they reveal that monastic life wasn't always as dry and pious as we imagine. Sometimes it had a wicked sense of humor. And it wasn't just the men. Nuns, too, wrote poetry and letters, some of it surprisingly sensual. A 12th century nun named Heloise wrote a series of deeply emotional, often heartbreaking letters to her former lover and secret husband, Peter Abelard. In them, she confesses not just love, but desire. Even after joining the convent, she writes, "I would rather be your whore than another man's wife." Not exactly the sort of thing you expect from a nun in full habit. Let's talk about symbolism. In the medieval Christian worldview, sex and spirituality were intertwined in strange ways. The church was obsessed with purity, but also fascinated by temptation. This tension produced imagery that was, frankly, loaded. For instance, grapes, lilies, doves, and gardens often symbolized virginity or spiritual love, but depending on context, they could also hint at erotic undertones. The garden in particular was a favorite. Think about it. Enclosed, lush, fertile, sounds more like a romantic hideaway than a theological metaphor. In fact, some nuns' mystical writings describe their souls entering God's garden, where he feeds them sweet fruit and speaks with overwhelming tenderness. If it sounds like a romantic rendezvous, that's the point. Some scholars argue this language helped religious women navigate a life of enforced chastity by transforming longing into spiritual connection. Others note that not all readers were so lofty. Medieval audiences may have read these texts with a mix of reverence and raised eyebrows. One quirky tidbit: in certain monastic manuals there were strict rules against monks embracing each other too long during the piece or touching during sleep. Just casual bedtime policies. And in the 11th century, the Abbey of Cluny banned affectionate letters between monks, especially ones that referenced the beauty of one's voice or skin. Not suspicious at all. But here, where things get stranger, some monasteries actually housed erotic art. Not pornographic exactly, but sensual sculptures of lovers, frescoes of Adam and Eve gazing at each other in longing, even stained glass windows showing biblical couples in near embrace. These weren't hidden, they were part of the sacred space. Because in medieval theology, creation itself was good, including the body, at least in theory. The reality was more complicated. Monks struggled, nuns struggled. They fasted, prayed, and sometimes punished themselves in hopes of banishing lust. One monk in the 14th century confessed to having uncontrollable dreams of flesh and reportedly slept with a thorny belt under his robes to keep temptation at bay. Spoiler, it didn't help. And yet, despite it all, desire leaked into the very texts meant to transcend it. It's as if no matter how high the walls of the monastery, human longing found a way through, in metaphor, in art, in margins, and in midnight confessions whispered behind heavy doors. So now you're back in the scriptorium. The candles burned low. The monk across from you gently closes the manuscript, clears his throat, and says nothing. You both pretend the illustrations were purely symbolic. You both know better. You wake up in a bed that's not yours, in a home that's not yours, and in a century where the term privacy barely exists. There's someone snoring beside you, your spouse, hopefully. Around you, several children are curled up on pallets of straw, wrapped in coarse linen. A dog's nose is pressed against your foot. Through the thin wooden walls, you hear your neighbors coughing, arguing, laughing. There is no bedroom. You are living, like most medieval people did, in a communal domestic space. And tonight, we're exploring what it meant to be intimate when everyone was watching, or at least, pretending not to. Let's not romanticize it. The average medieval peasant family lived in a one-room house, often shared with animals, tools, children, and visiting relatives. These weren't cozy cottages from fairy tales. They were practical, smoky, and crowded. A small hearth might warm the room, but there was no real barrier between daytime life and nighttime life. So if you were a married couple looking to, say, reconnect after a long day of thrashing wheat or tending pigs, well, good luck finding privacy. So how did people have sex in this setup? They got creative. Sometimes, couples would wait until everyone was asleep, pulling a woolen curtain around their straw bed, or even just burying themselves under heavy blankets. Some homes had a small elevated sleeping loft, an inch of separation that might feel like a mile in terms of privacy. In rare cases, wealthier peasants might have a bed with actual curtains, a luxury item that served both to conserve heat and to block peeping eyes. But still, sex in the Middle Ages was often an open secret, something done discreetly but rarely far from others. Children likely learned about it by proximity, long before anyone explained it. And remember, the medieval church discouraged speaking openly about sex, even in marriage. So for many, their understanding of intimacy came from hushed whispers, vague warnings, and observation. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants viewed sex as purely practical or as something more affectionate. Some suggest it was just part of daily life, like washing clothes or baking bread. Others point to folk songs and riddles that suggest humor, desire, and even flirtation in the way people talked about coupling. Either way, intimacy had to adapt to tight quarters and tighter schedules. And then there's the whole family planning situation. Despite what you may have heard, medieval people weren't entirely clueless about controlling reproduction. Couples used a mix of herbs, timing, and superstition to try to influence conception. For instance, wild carrot seed, what we now call Queen Anne's lace, was chewed as a natural contraceptive. Other methods included coitus interruptus, prayers to saints, and even wearing amulets said to repel pregnancy. One popular charm involved a dried weasel testicle sewn into a pouch. Stylish and practical. But birth control wasn't just a physical act, it was also a spiritual gamble. The church preached that every act of intercourse should be open to procreation. So deliberately avoiding pregnancy, even within marriage, could be seen as sinful. That said, the rules were flexible depending on who you were, where you lived, and how loudly your priest snored during confession. Let's shift the scene for a moment. You're in a medieval tavern now, the fire crackling, mugs sloshing, the air thick with wood smoke and fermented apples. Here, intimacy looks different. It's louder, freer, and often temporary. The tavern wench leans a bit too close. A traveling peddler flashes a coin. A flirtatious game of dice ends with two people disappearing behind the stables. These weren't proper relationships, but they existed, and they reveal a truth. Not all medieval intimacy was confined to marriage. In towns and cities, especially during fairs or feast days, sexual encounters could be spontaneous. The church frowned upon it, of course, but there was often a blind eye turned to what went on in the alleys, so long as no one got too loud, pregnant, or caught in public. Prostitution, though morally condemned, was still tolerated in many cities, and we'll explore that more in a later section. For now, just know, not everyone waited for a wedding night. And what about affection? Contrary to the myth of loveless medieval marriages, many couples, especially peasants, likely shared genuine warmth. You can find traces of it in wills that leave beloved items to spouses, in letters rare but revealing, and in the way language evolved. Words like sweetheart, darling, and honey pop up in Middle English texts, nestled among far bawdier terms we won't repeat here. One quirky detail: medieval people often slept naked, even in cold weather. Not for sexy reasons, but because clothes were expensive and rarely washed. Nightshirts were more common for wealthier folk, but for the average peasant, it was better to hang your sweaty tunic by the fire and crawl under a blanket in your skin. Which meant, naturally, that opportunities for intimacy were never far off. Still, cultural attitudes varied wildly. In some regions, new couples were expected to consummate their marriage with witnesses nearby, either listening from outside the door or even standing in the room, watching respectfully and probably awkwardly. This wasn't meant to be invasive. It was legal proof that the marriage was valid. Imagine trying to perform under that kind of pressure. One of the stranger practices, the bundling bag, used especially in parts of Northern Europe and later colonial America. In this tradition, an unmarried couple could spend the night together, but they'd be sewn or tied into separate sacks or separated by a physical board on the bed. The idea was that they could talk and get close without, getting close. Historians still debate how well that worked. Spoiler, not great. So you settle back in your peasant bed, the fire crackling low, a cow shifting sleepily in the corner. You pull the blanket tighter, your spouse's hand brushing yours beneath the coarse linen. There's no privacy, not really. But there is warmth, connection, maybe even love. You've survived another day, and that's reason enough to draw close and share what little space you have. You squint up at the ceiling of a candle-lit chamber. The smell of lavender clings to the sheets, faint but intentional, an effort to mask the lingering odors of chamber pots and unwashed linen. A pair of velvet slippers lies near the bed. This isn't a peasant's home anymore. You're in a wealthier medieval household, and everything, from the carved bedposts to the embroidered coverlet, whispers status. But here's the twist. Wealth doesn't necessarily buy better sex. Tonight, we're exploring how intimacy played out behind the heavy drapes of elite medieval bedrooms, and how power, performance, and politics tangled themselves in the sheets. Let's start with marriage, because in this world, who you married mattered more than how you felt about them. Among the nobility and merchant classes, marriages were arranged, negotiated, and brokered like livestock deals, with a few love poems sprinkled in for flair. A teenage noblewoman might be matched to a man twice her age because his lands bordered her father's. A merchant's daughter might be wed to a cousin in the next town to consolidate trade routes. Love wasn't irrelevant, but it came later if it came at all. As one 12th century nobleman famously wrote, "First, we marry. Then, we learn to love." Sex then was often ceremonial. On the wedding night, it wasn't just the couple involved. Their families, or at least a few trusted servants, might be waiting outside the room, ready to confirm that the union had been properly sealed. A stained sheet, a blush, a song sung too loudly, any of these could serve as proof. In extreme cases, witnesses were invited to observe the undressing or even more intimate moments, though thankfully, not all regions took things that far. The elite bedchamber, unlike its peasant counterpart, was layered with symbolism. A large canopied bed dominated the room, often raised on a platform and draped with expensive fabric. The linens might be monogrammed. The headboard could be carved with religious scenes or suggestive pagan motifs, depending on the family's taste. And yes, some noble couples had marriage beds blessed by clergy, meant to sanctify not just the act but the purpose, producing heirs. That's the kicker. For the upper classes, sex wasn't just about pleasure, it was about legacy. Producing a male heir was a civic duty, a religious obligation, and a personal obsession for many noble couples. Failure to conceive could lead to annulment, scandal, or worse. Entire dynasties hung in the balance with each passing month. Still, even under all that pressure, couples found moments of intimacy. Historians still argue whether noblewomen had much say in their sexual relationships. Some records suggest they were expected to be passive, chaste, and obedient. Others hint at private letters, cheeky poetry, and lovers' tokens exchanged in secret. The truth, likely a mix of both. Let's slip away from the bedchamber for a moment and peek inside the medical books of the day. You'll find fascinating, and occasionally terrifying, advice on how to enhance pleasure or encourage conception. Physicians of the time believed that both the man and the woman needed to achieve climax for pregnancy to occur. This wasn't about female pleasure, it was about bodily humors aligning properly. Still, it meant there was some scientific encouragement for women to enjoy themselves, theoretically. Some manuals recommended foods to increase passion: onions, garlic, honey, and wine spiced with cinnamon. Others warned against too much pleasure, lest it unbalance your humors and cause melancholy or madness. One particularly dramatic text claimed that excessive sex could cause a man, marrow to boil and weaken his sight. Talk about performance anxiety. And of course, there were aphrodisiacs. Mandrake root, for example, was believed to stir up desire, though it also had hallucinogenic properties. Some lovers tucked sprigs of rosemary or lavender under pillows to encourage tenderness. A particularly odd recipe involved boiling a goat's heart and feeding it to your partner. Romantic, no. But what about when intimacy wasn't freely given? In elite households, power imbalances could warp relationships. Servants and handmaids were often at the mercy of their employers. Ladies-in-waiting might be gifted to visiting nobles. Consent was a murky concept, and sexual exploitation was sometimes cloaked in silence or formality. One chilling reality: royal courts occasionally kept official mistresses, women acknowledged and even honored for their sexual roles, though they walked a tightrope of favor and scandal. Still, not all elite intimacy was cold or transactional. Some noble couples genuinely adored one another. You'll find touching epitaphs where widowed lords call their wives the joy of my days, and poems written in trembling Latin professing undying love. One knight famously refused to remarry after his wife's death, claiming, "I have known heaven already." Let's zoom back to daily life. You walk the hallways of a stone manor. Tapestries rustle as servants pass. A soft hush falls over the house as the sun sets. Behind one carved door, a noblewoman sits brushing her hair, humming a tune. Behind another, a young couple shares a whispered laugh. Somewhere in the kitchen, a cook flirts with a page boy over spilled mead. For all the rules and rituals, elite medieval households still pulsed with human warmth. People found ways to connect, through touch, through laughter, through late-night walks in garden courtyards. Not every encounter was romantic or even consensual, but desire, as ever, found cracks to bloom in. And what about same-sex relationships? We'll get into that in detail in the next section, but know this: even within these rigid structures, people loved and longed in all directions. Hidden letters, coded poems, and awkward silences between glances hint at a spectrum of connection history only partly recorded. For now, the candle flickers low. A heavy curtain falls closed. Footsteps echo down the corridor. Another noble night begins, wrapped in silks and secrecy. You're sitting on a stone bench in the cloistered garden of a medieval abbey. Moonlight glints off a small pool, and the air is heavy with the scent of rosemary and crushed thyme. A monk passes by, nodding politely, his sandals scuffing the gravel. Nearby, two novices are whispering, too closely, too intently. You pretend not to notice, but let's be honest, something going on here. Tonight, you're stepping into the hushed, often invisible world of same-sex desire in the Middle Ages, a topic wrapped in shadow, coded language, and double meanings. But it was always there, poolsing quietly beneath the surface, from cloisters and castles to scriptoriums and city alleys. Let's start with what we know for sure. Same-sex relationships existed, love existed, and desire, whether acted upon or not, found its expression in ways both subtle and bold. In medieval Europe, particularly Christian Europe, the church held the loudest microphone on the subject of sexuality. Officially, same-sex acts were condemned, lumped under the catch-all term sodomy, which covered everything from masturbation to oral sex to anything not strictly aimed at procreation. But as with many rules, enforcement was inconsistent, punishment uneven, and reality more complex. Historians still argue whether medieval people viewed homosexuality the same way we do today. Categories like gay or straight didn't exist in the same identity-driven sense. Instead, behavior was judged on a case-by-case basis, often with a strange blend of moralism, curiosity, and occasionally blind eyes. Some of the clearest glimpses into same-sex desire come from monastic writings. Monks and nuns lived in same-gender communities, often isolated for life. Emotional closeness was natural, even encouraged, spiritual friendship, they called it. But sometimes those bonds crossed into romantic or physical territory. One 12th century abbot warned his brothers against excessive fondness between monks, nodding that the devil may wear the face of a friend. There's also the poetry. Oh, the poetry. Take the case of Alcuin of York, a celebrated 8th century scholar whose surviving letters to fellow monks are drenched in longing. "My soul clings to you," he wrote, "and I desire to embrace you in spirit and flesh." Sounds romantic. It absolutely is. But because he cloaked it in spiritual language, it skated under the radar. In female monastic communities, too, we find layered intimacy. One famous case involves Hildegard of Bingen, a visionary nun and composer. While her writings stay within the bounds of theology, her letters to fellow nuns are fervent and emotionally intense. Another nun, Jewett of High, warned of sisters who became too attached to each other, suggesting that some of these friendships went far beyond embroidery circles. Of course, monasteries weren't the only settings for same-sex intimacy. Let's take a stroll through a medieval city after dark. You pass through a narrow alley behind the baker's shop, past the tanner's yard, and into the shadows where marginal communities gathered. Here, gender roles blur and relationships become harder to define. Men dress in women's clothing, sometimes for theater, sometimes not. Secret codes develop. A glance held too long. A door left ajar at midnight. The world of male brothels, which existed in several European cities, becomes a quiet sanctuary for men seeking one another. One shocking fact: a brothel for men existed in 14th century London, tolerated if not exactly approved by authorities for a time. In Florence, records from the Office of the Night, a special court created to investigate sodomy, reveal a staggering number of cases, many involving consensual relationships between men of all ages. Some were punished, others fined. A few simply disappeared from the record. And yet, for all the fear and repression, same-sex desire continued to echo in the margins. In literature, we find hints and metaphors. Tristan and Isolde is about heterosexual passion, sure, but the friendship between Tristan and his male companion is almost equally intense. In chivalric romances, knights swear undying loyalty to one another, their bond sometimes described in language as intimate as any lovers. Historians debate whether these were symbolic of brotherhood or quietly reflective of deeper affections. Then there's the strange, layered case of cross-dressing saints. Several medieval saints were biologically female but lived as men, often to escape unwanted marriages or live religious lives. Saint Marina, for example, joined a monastery disguised as a man, and when accused of fathering a child, she accepted punishment rather than reveal her identity. Some modern scholars interpret these tales as early expressions of gender variance. Others see them as morality plays. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. And what about law? While church writings were harsh, secular penalties for same-sex acts varied wildly. In some places, repeat offenses meant death. In others, the punishment was lighter than for adultery or theft. Social class often determined consequences. A peasant might be whipped or fined, while a noble could simply be sent on pilgrimage as penance. One of the most famous same-sex couples in medieval history, King Edward II of England and Piers Gaveston, faced relentless scrutiny. Edward's affection for Gaveston was intense, public, and widely criticized. Chronicles describe their relationship as unseemly, and Gaveston was eventually exiled and later executed. Whether their connection was romantic, sexual, or simply an unusually deep friendship, we'll never know. But their story suggests a public discomfort with intimacy between men, even at the highest levels. Let's zoom back out for a moment. You're standing in a candle-lit chapel. A monk sings quietly in the distance. In a side alcove, two young novices sit close, one reading aloud from a psalter, the other watching his lips more than the page. It's quiet, reverent, and deeply human. Same-sex desire in the Middle Ages wasn't just about sex. It was about love. It was about connection in a world that often demanded silence. People carved out secret spaces. They used metaphors, poetry, and prayer. They took risks, and sometimes they found joy. Even today, we're still piecing together these hidden histories. Fragments of letters, court records, paintings with curious figures in the margins. Every discovery adds another layer to the truth, that love in all its forms has always existed, tender, risky, and defiantly real. You're sitting in the smoky corner of a medieval tavern now, the kind of place where the rushes haven't been changed in a month and someone is probably bartering a chicken for mead. You lean back against the wooden wall, watching a traveling minstrel finish his bawdy song. The room bursts into laughter. Half the jokes were about farts, the other half about sex. You get the sense everyone here knows more than they let on. Tonight's chapter opens a window into a world often overlooked but absolutely teeming with erotic energy. The role of sexual humor, innuendo, and vulgar entertainment in medieval life. Spoiler, people laughed. A lot. And they laughed about sex. We tend to picture the Middle Ages as strict, pious, maybe even a little prudish. But that's only part of the story. Beneath the sermons and saints' lives was a thriving culture of lowbrow humor, raucous festivals, cheeky art, and ribald tailies, a kind of medieval stand-up comedy circuit, if you will. Let's start with fabliaux, those wildly inappropriate, shockingly clever short stories popular in France during the 12th and 13th centuries. These little narrative gems, usually performed aloud, were crammed with trickery, adultery, mistaken identities, and genitals doing very silly things. In one fabliau, a wife convinces her dim-witted husband that a certain stick in her body is loose and only a priest's holy rod can fix it. In another, a man pretends to be dead so he can eavesdrop on his wife's secret lover, only to end up publicly humiliated in his own coffin. That one ends with the chorus, and thus, the lady knew two swords could fit in one scabbard. Yes, that was the punchline. Even the Canterbury Tales, which your high school teacher probably framed as literature, has full sections that read like a medieval Judd Apatow script. The Miller's Tale includes a student tricked into kissing someone's naked rear end through a window. Moments later, he's branded with a hot iron in the same location. Moral of the story: never trust a carpenter who locks his wife in a tower. Also, ouch. Historians still argue how widespread this bawdy humor really was among lower classes, since much of what survives was written by educated clerics. But the sheer volume of off-color material suggests that these stories weren't just academic jokes. They were performed, repeated, and loved. Even church art wasn't immune. Let's walk together through a medieval church. At first it's solemn, saints, crucifixes, angels. But down in the carvings on pews or tucked beneath choir stalls called misericords, you might spot something unexpected. A man mooning the congregation, a naked woman chasing a priest, a monkey examining its own behind. These were not accidents. They were crafted by hand, by artists with a sense of humor and likely some creative freedom when no one was watching. Some scholars call these carvings a form of folk resistance. Quiet ways to mock authority, nudge boundaries, or just entertain parishioners stuck in church for 5 hours. Then there's festival culture. The Middle Ages had official celebrations, of course, Easter, Christmas, saints' days, but also a wild roster of carnivals, feast days, and misrule events, where the world turned upside down. During the Feast of Fools, junior clergy would dress as bishops, sing obscene songs, and stage mock sermons laced with sexual innuendo. One surviving record describes a holy fart offered as incense. Another involves a pretend marriage between 2 male deacons, blessed with a goat and a slap on the rear. No, really. During Carnival, especially in cities like Venice or Cologne, people wore masks, drank excessively, and acted out exaggerated versions of sex roles. Women seducing monks, men dressing as pregnant nuns, and plenty of groin-centric pantomimes. These festivals temporarily suspended moral codes, allowing people to explore taboos and let off steam before Lent clamped everything shut again. In the realm of medieval medicine, there was humor too. One satirical text describes a cure for impotence that involves rubbing a mixture of goose fat and crushed testicles on the patient's forehead while chanting a very suggestive rhyme. Did it work? Highly doubtful, but someone clearly thought it was hilarious. And what about folk songs and riddles? English and German traditions are full of what scholars politely call double entendre riddles. One famous one goes like this. I am a wondrous creature, I hang by the thigh of a man. I point toward the ground and I'm used at night. When women touch me, they scream. Answer: a key. Sure, definitely a key. But people weren't just laughing, they were also pushing boundaries. Vulgar humor acted as a pressure valve, a way to comment on power, poke fun at hypocrisy, and flirt publicly under the guise of play. A farmer could mock his lord, a wife could mock her husband, a monk could wink at his own vows, all without technically breaking the rules. Of course, not everyone approved. The church constantly tried to rein in such behaviors. Priests railed against obscene games, lewd dances, and songs that blackened the soul. One bishop banned laughter entirely during Easter week, calling it the devil's echo. Spoiler: no one listened. Even legal documents weren't safe. Some records from city courts include scribes sneaking in slang terms for genitals or adding personal jokes in the margins. Imagine centuries of dusty paperwork, and one clerk just couldn't resist adding a doodle of two butts dueling with swords. And let's not forget the performers themselves, jesters, minstrels, and fools. These weren't just clowns, they were often politically savvy entertainers, allowed to say things no one else could. One jester reportedly mocked a king's poor performance in bed, in front of the entire court. Instead of execution, he got a raise. Bold move. So what does all this tell you? That sex, even in a deeply religious, hierarchical society, was never entirely hidden. It was joked about, sung about, carved in wood, and acted out in full costume. Humor gave people a way to talk about the unspeakable, to laugh at the rules and sometimes to break them, to make a pass without consequences, to remind each other in the safest and silliest ways possible that everyone, highborn or low, monk or maiden, was still deeply, embarrassingly human. You down the last of your mead. The room is roaring now. Someone tells a joke about a nun, a chicken, and a lat. You laugh anyway because honestly it's contagious. The firelight flickers, casting dancing shadows on the crooked beams overhead. Someone starts a lute tune that's just barely staying in tune, and a few people around you start clapping in rhythm. For a moment you forget the cold outside, the fleas in the straw, the plague rumors whispered 2 villages over. This is warmth. This is joy. And this is sex through the lens of humor, community, and the shared ridiculousness of simply being human. But let's step out of the tavern now. You move through a narrow alley, torchlight flickering on wet cobblestones, and duck into a quieter space, a modest stone chamber where 2 women sit in the candlelight. They're not laughing, they're whispering. Now we shift into something heavier, the control of sexuality by church and state, and what happened when people stepped outside the official boundaries. You're walking into a world of law codes, sermons, and sin, but also one of secret lovers, forbidden encounters, and whispered confessions in the dark. Let's start with the church. From around the 12th century onward, religious authorities developed an increasingly detailed system for categorizing and regulating sexual behavior. The result was a world of moral micromanagement so intricate, it would make a modern HR department weep. According to medieval theologians, sex was technically allowed, but only within marriage, only for procreation, and only in specific positions. Deviate from that checklist and you risked your soul. Penitentials' manuals written for confessors included long lists of sins, complete with suggested penances. For example, oral sex, that's 3 years on bread and water. Masturbation, 2 years, having sex on a holy day, 1 year plus no meat. And yes, the holy day category included roughly 1/3 of the calendar year. The logic was part spiritual, part social. The church believed sexual sin corrupted not just the individual, but the entire community. And worse, it opened the door, literally and metaphorically, for demons. One text warns that unclean acts performed at night could attract incubi and succubi, lustful spirits who would seduce and drain you while you slept. Sleep tight. But not everyone obeyed, far from it. Historians still argue how effective these rules really were. Did peasants internalize them, or just nod along while secretly sneaking into haylofts? Did nobles feel guilt over their affairs, or simply fund a new chapel as insurance? The evidence is murky. What we do know is this: medieval people sinned, confessed, and sinned again. And in many cases, they weren't punished for what they did, but for being caught. Let's talk about punishment. If a married woman was caught in adultery, she might be publicly shamed, paraded through town in her shift, or forced to sit outside church with a sign reading "whore," or whatever the Latin equivalent was. In some places, a husband could legally beat his wife if she strayed. In others, she'd simply be divorced and cast out. Men, by contrast, got off lighter. A nobleman caught in an affair might face a fine. A priest caught with a mistress might be relocated or, in some cases, promoted. A double standard, absolutely. But in a patriarchal society where female virtue was linked to family honor, it made cruel, if predictable, sense. That brings us to sodomy, a term that covered a wide range of non-procreative sexual acts, especially between men. In cities like Florence or Avignon, authorities tracked sodomy cases obsessively. Young apprentices, noblemen, clergy, no one was above suspicion. Punishments ranged from fines and exile to, in rare cases, execution. But here's the contradiction. While authorities condemned same-sex activity, they also created environments where it could flourish. Monasteries, all-male guilds, even choir schools. Some historians argue that same-sex desire was an open secret, tolerated so long as it didn't threaten public order or generate scandal. And speaking of scandal, let's talk about forbidden love, affairs between nobles and servants, clergy falling for widows, lovers who crossed social lines or religious boundaries. These stories didn't just exist, they thrived in literature, folklore, and real life. One surviving court case from 14th century Paris tells of a nun who escaped her convent by dressing as a man, lived with her female lover for years, and was only discovered after dying in childbirth. The record calls it a tragedy, but you can't help imagining those years of stolen freedom as a kind of miracle. The real risk wasn't always legal, it was social ruin. For women especially, sexual missteps could mean the loss of marriage prospects, inheritance rights, or even custody of their children. A noblewoman impregnated outside wedlock might be cloistered. A peasant girl might be married off in haste, or abandoned altogether. That's why some turn to magic and folk remedies, hopping to avoid consequences. One recipe from a 13th century herbal recommends boiling rosemary, sage, and fennel into a womb bath to prevent pregnancy. Another suggests tying a dried weasel foot around your thigh as contraceptive protection. Do these work? Not a chance, but they reveal how desperate people were to control their bodies in a world where they had little say. We also see the fingerprints of fear in architecture. In some towns, you can still find chastity houses, small locked rooms where noblewomen were kept before marriage, guarded to ensure virginity. One even had a window with angled bars so the girl could see out but no one could see in. Romantic, isn't it? But repression always invites rebellion. Lovers found ways, messages sewn into hems, midnight trysts in kitchens, secret tokens buried under doorsteps. The human need to connect, to touch, to love, to desire, refused to be contained by rules carved into stone or written in trembling Latin script. And sometimes, the community looked the other way. In small villages, where everyone knew everyone else's secrets, a quiet affair might be tolerated if it didn't cause problems. A widowed neighbor might take a companion without formal marriage. A shepherd might visit a milkmaid more often than necessary. There was no official permission, only a silent consensus. We'll pretend not to see. The contradiction sits at the heart of medieval life. Publicly, sex was policed, moralized, judged. Privately, it pulsed through songs, jokes, art, and desire. People laughed at it, cried over it, made choices about it, and more often than not got away with it. You leave the stone room back into the night air, where a cat slips by and a door creaks shut behind you. Somewhere nearby, a candle been blown out, and a pair of voices fall into silence. Because no matter how many rules were written in the end, sex was never just about sin. It was also about survival, expression, and longing. And those things, medieval or modern, don't vanish when the lights go out. You follow the narrow lane until it opens onto a village square. It's market day, and for once the air doesn't smell like smoke and turnips. There's a freshness to it. Maybe it's the scent of dried lavender in baskets or the hint of yeast rising from newly baked rye loaves. As you drift through the crowd, you hear snippets of conversation, laughter, and haggling, but also something stranger. A group of women is clustered near a cart, giggling over what looks like a bundle of carved wooden toys. The merchant smirks, says nothing. You lean in closer, and no, your eyes aren't deceiving you. One of them is very much in the shape of a phallus. Welcome to a world rarely spoken of in sermons. Sexual aids, folk remedies, and the hidden economy of pleasure. Because behind all the moral codes, behind the anxious confessions and public punishments, medieval people still craved delight. And as you're about to see, they were startlingly inventive about pursuing it. Let's start with what you just witnessed, artificial phalluses. Yep, they existed. And no, they weren't always hidden in shame. Some were shaped from wood, others from leather or bread dough. That's right, bread. There are records including a few monastic complaints about women baking phallic shapes, drying them hard, and using them either ritually or not so ritually. Historians still argue how common these objects were. Some insist they were fringe items, more joke than utility. Others believe they were a quiet part of women's communities, shared knowledge passed down, not written down. Either way, it's clear. When society told women that pleasure didn't belong to them, some of them found ways to reclaim it. But pleasure was more than physical. It was also medicinal. In medieval medicine, sexuality was deeply linked to the balance of humors. A woman who was too cold and wet might be prescribed more sex. A man who was too hot and dry might be told to cool his passions with a calming diet, or ironically, even more sex to release excess heat. This wasn't about sin, it was science, or at least what passed for science. Midwives and cunning women often kept hand-written remedy books filled with treatments for everything from lost desire to unwanted pregnancy. One such text, written in a mix of Latin, French, and local dialect, advised women to drink a wine boiled with mint and marjoram, to lift the heart and stir the womb. Another warned men not to eat too many onions or garlic before bed, unless they wanted to wake with more fire than sleep. Some of these recipes actually had basis in herbal effectiveness. Fennel, pennyroyal, and silphium, an ancient contraceptive now tragically extinct, were used for birth control. Rue and juniper were employed to stimulate menstruation, code, often, for abortifacient attempts. But here's where it gets risky. Using these herbs, or even being caught with a forbidden recipe, could lead to accusations of witchcraft. And that's the next layer of danger. See, pleasure and power were dangerously intertwined. A woman with knowledge of herbs might be respected or feared. And if she didn't conform, if she didn't confess, if someone's child died under her care, she might end up on trial. But not all erotic knowledge was hidden. Some of it was sold. Let's talk about brothels, because not every sexual transaction happened behind closed doors and locked hearts. Across Europe, especially in growing cities like London, Paris, and Venice, sex work wasn't just tolerated, it was regulated. In many towns, officials licensed brothels, taxed them, and even required health inspections, as rudimentary as those were. Some cities built entire red light districts near docks or city gates. In Southwark, just outside London's jurisdiction, a whole community of women lived under the bishop's control, paying rent for the right to work, but also subject to his arbitrary punishments. Brothels often operated under the name of stews, named for the hot communal baths where clients could lounge before or after more intimate activities. And yes, people absolutely went for the bath part too. Cleanliness wasn't common, and a hot soak could be a luxury even more enticing than what followed. Sex workers had an ambiguous status. Some lived relatively well, dressing in bright colors, wearing modest jewelry, even holding savings. Others were exploited, trafficked, or abandoned when they became pregnant or ill. Yet even within these hardships, many developed tight communities and mutual support networks. There's evidence of women bailing each other out of jail, raising one another's children, or retiring together and opening taverns. And here's something strange but true. During certain religious festivals, some towns would invite sex workers into churches to confess and be temporarily cleansed of sin, only to return to work a few days later. It was a cycle of guilt, forgiveness, and return, like a spiritual laundromat. Of course, brothels weren't the only places to find intimacy. Traveling entertainers, pilgrims, soldiers, all brought stories, desires, and trysts with them. And with that travel came a thriving underground market for love spells, potions, and charms. One charm found scratched into a pew in a remote French church reads, "Bind his heart to mine as the moon to the tide." Another, hidden in a lace collar, was stitched with rosewater and powdered amber, meant to ensure fidelity. Did they work? Maybe not. But when you're desperate for someone's affection, sometimes belief is its own magic. Some rituals were downright elaborate. In parts of Germany, a girl might bury her lover's hair in a crossroads under the full moon to make him return. In Italy, women brewed wine with apples they'd bitten, believing it carried their essence. One infamous Spanish remedy for heartbreak advised drinking goat's milk mixed with the ashes of your ex's love letters. As ridiculous as some of this sounds, it all points to the same truth. Desire doesn't follow rules. And when you're told your pleasure is dangerous, sinful, or shameful, you don't stop wanting. You just get creative about how you chase it. There's one more corner to explore before we leave this subject. It's quiet here, stone walls, incense, the faint sound of chanting. You've stepped into a monastery. You'd think this would be the last place for sexual energy to linger, but you'd be wrong. Medieval monks and nuns lived under strict vows, but they were still human. Letters survive from nuns begging their confessors for help resisting lustful thoughts. One monk famously wrote a treatise on how to avoid sinful dreams, only to be caught years later in bed with a novice. Oops. And it wasn't always scandal. Sometimes it was longing, deep, spiritual, even erotic longing. Some mystics wrote of their love for Christ in terms that, frankly, would make your grandmother blush. St. Teresa of Avila described a vision where an angel pierced her heart with divine fire, leaving her breathless with joy. Interpret that how you will. Even in celibate spaces, the language of intimacy didn't disappear. It just transformed into metaphor, into poetry, into dreams. You're back in the market square now. The crowd has thinned. The laughter has faded. A breeze kicks up, scattering flower petals across the stones. Somewhere behind you, a girl presses a charm into her pocket. A boy fingers the ribbon tied around his wrist. A mother stirs herbs into a pot and says nothing. They're not thinking about sin. They're thinking about hope, risk, and the age-old hunger for connection. Because in the end, the medieval world didn't kill desire. It just disguised it, redirected it, and more often than not, found ways to laugh about it anyway. Animals, taboos, and trial records. You wake in the half-light before dawn. The church bell hasn't rung yet, but a strange hush blankets the town square. You follow a group of people moving in silence, faces pale, lips tight. They're not headed to mass, they're going to the courthouse. Today, there's going to be a trial, but this isn't just any case. This time, the accused is a pig. Yes, a pig, and not just for stealing crops or rooting through the churchyard. No, this pig stands accused of something far darker, sexual crimes. It sounds absurd now, but in the medieval mind, animals could sin and courts could prosecute them. There are dozens, perhaps hundreds, of surviving records where animals, especially pigs, goats, and donkeys, were tried for rape, bestiality, and even murder. And in many cases, they were sentenced to death. One infamous case from 1386 in France describes a sow dressed in human clothes and executed in the town square after being convicted of attacking a child. The case made waves across Europe, not because the idea was shocking, but because the pig had been dressed to resemble a human. Justice, after all, had to be visible. But these weren't just spectacles. These cases reflected the deep anxieties of the age about sin, order, and what separated man from beast. In the medieval worldview, humans were made in God's image. Animals were not. So when an animal crossed a line, especially into the realm of sexual taboo, it was seen as a cosmic rupture, something that had to be punished or purged to restore balance. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many of these cases weren't about animals at all. They were about people, usually poor, often mentally unwell or socially isolated, who were accused of bestiality. Sometimes they were accused alongside animals. Sometimes they were tried alone with brutal consequences. In the eyes of the church, bestiality was among the worst sins, a crime against nature and God. Punishments ranged from public flogging to death by fire, and like other sexual sins, mere suspicion could ruin lives. But these cases also reveal how medieval justice blurred the line between symbol and fact. Trials were moral theater as much as legal proceeding, and the obsession with purity, of body, of blood, of sexual boundaries, often led to tragic absurdities. Still, not every taboo involved violence. Some were simply unspoken truths. Take incest. In the Middle Ages, the church had incredibly strict rules on kinship. You could be barred from marrying someone as distant as your seventh cousin. Why? Because family ties, especially among nobility, were both sacred and political. Breaking them, even unintentionally, could lead to annulments, excommunications, or scandals whispered for decades. Then there was necrophilia, so disturbing that few records survive, and most that do are cloaked in euphemism. One 14th century English court case refers to a gravedigger disturbing the rest of maidens. Another, more chilling, tells of a monk exhumed after death to reveal marks that should never have been there. These cases were rare, but their very existence shows how broad the medieval imagination of sin really was. Nothing was off-limits to scrutiny. Everything could be corrupted. And when something fell too far outside the boundaries, something so strange, so threatening to the social fabric, it was labeled demonic. Yes, literal demons. Medieval people believed in spiritual warfare. The devil wasn't just lurking in temptation. He could invade your bedroom. Women claimed to have been visited by incubi, male demons who assaulted them in their sleep. Men told of succubi draining their strength, stealing seed to fuel hellish births. These weren't just stories. Some people were convinced these attacks were real, visions born of fever, sleep paralysis, or trauma. And tragically, sometimes these demonic episodes were used to cover up abuse no one wanted to admit. The church took such claims seriously. There were prayers, holy relics, and entire manuals for exorcising sexual demons. One monk advised sleeping with a crucifix beneath your pillow. Another warned against spicy food, lest it awaken lust and invite the devil into your dreams. It was a world on edge, forever watching the borders of the body, the soul, and the law. And perhaps the strangest records of all, cases where people claimed to have married spirits. A woman in 15th century Germany swore she was spiritually wed to a dead knight who visited her nightly. Her village exiled her. A man in England said he was in love with a fairy woman and refused to take a human wife. He vanished one winter, leaving only footprints that ended at the frozen river. Were they mad, lying, lonely? Or were they just trying to carve out space in a world that offered no room for non-normative desire? What's clear is this: the medieval world wasn't just obsessed with sex. It was obsessed with categorizing it, tamming it, punishing it, making it fit inside a moral framework. And when it did, it had to be purged, or hidden, or killed. You step away from the courthouse, the echo of judgment still ringing in your ears. The crowd disperses, leaving only silence. A pig squeals from a distant pen. A girl pulls her shawl tight. Somewhere nearby, the church bell finally tolls. Sex in the Middle Ages was not just a private act. It was a battlefield between purity and corruption, between animal and human, between the flesh and the soul. And not everyone survived the fight. The secret lives behind monastery walls. You walk through the cloistered halls, your footsteps muffled by ancient stone and the scent of incense. Outside, the world clatters with market gossip, drunkards, and the occasional scandal. But in here, behind the heavy wooden doors of the monastery, it's all supposed to be silence, prayer, and purity. Supposed to be. The truth is, the Middle Ages were full of contradictions, and perhaps nowhere more so than in the celibate sanctuaries of monks and nuns. You step into the scriptorium, where a young monk scribbles Latin beside a flickering candle. His brow is furrowed, not in devotion but in distraction. His eyes keep drifting toward the doorway. Because the fantasy of a purely asexual, self-denying monastic life, that was often just that, a fantasy. Despite vows of chastity, sex still found its way behind the walls. Sometimes in the form of love letters. A stash of them was discovered in the margins of a prayer book, hidden between psalms. Sometimes in midnight meetings, like the nun caught climbing out of a monk's dormitory in a rope made of knotted bedsheets. Other times, in whispered confessions from monks who struggled not just with lust, but with longing, regret, and isolation. In fact, many monasteries were rife with quiet scandals. In 14th century England, one bishop lamented that more children are born to nuns than honest wives. Harsh, yes, but also telling. Monasteries weren't just spiritual retreats. They were also homes for surplus daughters, failed sons, and anyone deemed unsuited for marriage. And not all of them came willingly. Some nuns, especially those from noble families, had little choice in their vocation. For them, life in the convent was often less about God and more about convenience, politics, or inheritance. And human desire, whether for touch, love, or power, didn't vanish at the altar. That's not to say all monastics broke their vows. Many lived devout, disciplined lives. But the historical record brims with examples that paint a more human picture. In one abbey, nuns were caught throwing secret feasts with local men. In another, a monk wrote passionate poems to a fellow brother, ending one with the heartbreaking line, "May I burn for loving you in this silent prison." And perhaps the most famous scandal of all, Peter Abelard and Heloise. Their tragic love story, teacher and student, secret marriage, forced castration, eventual separation into religious life, captivated medieval Europe. Their letters, preserved for centuries, still pulse with tenderness and unresolved passion. Heloise, now a nun, wrote to Abelard, "I would rather be your whore than the Empress of Rome." So much for monastic detachment. And yet, in some monasteries, desire was redirected, channeled into intense spiritual practices, acts of self-denial, or mystical experiences that blurred the lines between divine ecstasy and physical arousal. You read about female mystics who claimed to feel the wounds of Christ as if in their own flesh, about monks who described their love for God in the language of a lover's embrace. Historians still argue whether these were purely symbolic or expressions of sublimated sexuality, but the imagery is unmistakably intimate. Take Saint Teresa of Avila, centuries later, but deeply influenced by medieval monastic thought. Her writings speak of an angel piercing her with a golden spear, leaving me all on fire with a great love of God. Bernini's sculpture of the moment captures it with a passion that's hard to ignore. Back in the Middle Ages, these blurred lines between body and spirit weren't always seen as dangerous. In fact, mysticism offered a socially acceptable outlet for women's emotions and inner lives, especially in a world that denied them many other forms of self-expression. Still, for many behind monastic walls, the struggle was quieter, more private. Not everyone wrote poetry. Some just tried to follow the rules, to pray away their feelings, to forget the warmth of a hand, the ache of loneliness, or the memory of a life they never chose. One former monk, writing in exile, described his years in the monastery as a desert of silence where the wind carried only the sound of things I dared not say. In a world obsessed with controlling the body, monasteries were supposed to be fortresses of purity. But the body never really left. It stayed, longing, doubting, dreaming, inside the robe, beneath the habit, behind the locked door. You step back out into the daylight. The monastery is behind you now. Birds wheel above the stone arches. Somewhere, a bell rings for vespers. And just like that, the journey ends. From royal courts to brothels, peasant huts to sacred halls, you've traveled the tangled web of medieval sexuality. Not just the facts, but the fears, the fantasies, the fragile human needs that pulsed beneath it all. Sex in the Middle Ages wasn't just about desire. It was about order and chaos, heaven and earth, shame and longing, control and rebellion. And now, as you prepare to drift into sleep, remember this. Even in the strictest times, behind the heaviest doors, the human heart still found ways to beat. So now, with the flickering echoes of torchlight fading and the whispers of monastic prayers drifting into silence, you lie still. The long walk through the Middle Ages is behind you. The fire is low. Your breath has slowed. You've seen a world both alien and familiar, one where people loved awkwardly, longed deeply, and tried desperately to make sense of their bodies in a time that often feared them. They stitched desire into songs, tucked shame into confessionals, and chased redemption down candle-lit aisles. Tonight you've touched their lives, their secrets, their contradictions, and as you settle deeper beneath the blankets, perhaps you realize that in all their confusion, they were not so different from us. The night is quiet now. The wind has softened. That soft background hum, maybe your fan, maybe just the hush of sleep approaching, wraps around you like a woolen cloak. Let the stories fade. Let the candle gutter. Let the echoes of barefoot monks and giggling maids and scolding bishops dissolve into nothing. No more judgment here. No more questions. Just you, safe in this quiet place where even the strangest tales have softened into dreams. Sleep well, traveler. The Middle Ages will be here when you wake. Sweet dreams.